Namaste, this is New India Junction. I am Nivedita Tiwari. We have with us today Mr. Mohandas Pai and Ms. Nisha Hola. Mr. Pai does not need an introduction, but I'll still, for the benefit of the viewers, I will still give a small introduction. He's a Padma Shri awardee, a former CFO and board member at Infosys, co-founder of Akshay Patra, world's largest mid-day meal program. He has served as chairman of the board at SEBI and is now a board member of the NSE. He's an angel investor who invests in companies working in the field of life sciences and education. He's the current chairman of Manipal Global Education and also works actively with the government on policy recommendations. Nisha is a computational physicist and an engineer. She's currently a technology fellow at Center for Cellular and Molecular Platforms, and she writes extensively at the intersection of technology, economics, and policy. Mr. Pai and Nisha, welcome to New India Junction.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we'll be talking about India's potential, its purpose, and its promise as an Atmanirbhar Bharat. The Prime Minister, Mr. Narendra Modi, makes a very strong pitch for it. So what do you think would be a good roadmap to realize this vision, to see a self-reliant India?
Now, let me start. I think the important thing is the Prime Minister has given us a vision to be Atmanirbhar. And that's a very strong vision because we have had several Prime Ministers in the past give a vision to say we must be self-sufficient, we must be this, blah, 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 without doing anything. He has started the Make in India as a movement some time back, but it didn't work because there was no policy framework to back the Make in India. Now, whatever you do, we need an incentive policy framework because India is not competitive in many areas because of high cost. So he has set in motion a series of policy measures which will make India Atmanirbhar. Let me give some examples. First is that PLI program for mobile phones. India manufactures 250 million mobile phones, and we've been successful in phase one. In phase two, there were 45,000 crore program, whereby it's giving incentive based upon pace manufacturing. And already about $110 billion of export commitments have come in. Apple is coming in. Of course, the China spat also helped, and that's a good policy. Then they started a policy for drugs for APIs, active pharmaceutical ingredients, whereby they're incentivizing people to manufacture the APIs and they have to be self-sufficient. They're looking at some program for air conditioners because we import a lot from China. And then they're looking for something for automobiles too. I think in every area, they have to come out with certain programs to do this. And we have to improve our supply chain. China has got great supply chain. India's supply chain costs of 14% of GDP. China is 6%. America is 5%. After GST, it may come down to 12%, but it's still got 3 or 4% more. Better roads have to be built. The ports have to work faster, etc., and costs have to come down. Now, he's brought down the interest rates because of this COVID and the reduction in corporate taxes to 25% and to 15% for new manufacturing. Now, these are the policy measures. And of course, taking on China has been very good. Banning the Chinese apps has certainly shown India to be very innovative because as a country, we had given away 65% of our digital territory to China freely, almost freely, you know. There is nothing that we just gave it away. It is valuable and China was making a lot of money. So he shut it down. I hope he shuts down all the Chinese apps. And in telecommunication, Huawei had a free reign. We had sold this country to China because over the last 10 years, we have a trade deficit of $500 billion with China. China used to export $65-70 billion. We used to export $15-16 billion. China never opened up the market. I know this because I've been working on this since 1999 when I first went to China to set up Infosys. Then Vajpayee came there later, 2003 or 4. And, from that time, we've been asking the Chinese to open the market. They don't open up. So what Trump has done is right. What Modi has done is right. So I think all these things are creating the fervor in India that we've got to be self-sufficient. So leadership, vision, policy. And we need many more policies. Nisha?
So for Atmanirbhar Bharat, I think it's a great policy and great vision that the Prime Minister has set for India. It gives all of us something to align behind. The first thing he did was give us the 5 trillion goal by 2025. Then he said Atmanirbhar Bharat. And I think both of those go hand in hand. So we can look at 5 trillion economy by 2025 or 2026 because of COVID now. We can look at a 10 trillion economy by 2031 maybe and so forth. India has the capabilities and now we need vast policy changes and changes on the ground to be able to implement this. So if I had to list some points that are crucial for India to get right to implement the Atmanirbhar Bharat vision. First is infrastructure. MDP already alluded to it. We've already started, the finance ministry last year gave us a wonderful vision with the national infrastructure pipeline. They were looking at rural infrastructure, urban infrastructure, industrial estates, ports, railways. And looking at the vision now for Atmanirbhar Bharat, that national infrastructure pipeline is a good first step, but we need more. We need a lot more investment than the 102 lakh crores that was originally proposed by the finance ministry. We have to be very aggressive with our industrial clusters, high speed railways. We have to bring the dedicated freight corridors online as soon as possible, because as MDP said, our supply chain costs are too high to compete with China right now. China's supply chain costs are at 6%. We have to be able to match that to make the goods at the prices and the quality that we want to make in India and not have to import in from China. So infrastructure is very important to get right. The next thing is urbanization. Now, if you look at any country in the world, the urban centers are the engines of growth. That is the same for India. So the growth comes primarily from cities like Bangalore and Bombay, Delhi, Chennai, Hyderabad. And that is no longer sustainable because these cities are over at capacity or over capacity. Infrastructure is reeling under the strain of overpopulation. These cities can't produce a lot more. The step change required for Atmanirbhar Bharat is not going to come from these cities. Instead, we need to look at the rest of India. India is only 34% urbanized compared to 55% in the world at average, and China is at 59%, the US is at 82%. And so India needs to be able to match that for a very simple reason. Urban centers, because they concentrate human activity, that's where the specialization comes from, that's where productivity improvements come from, and that is where we need to capitalize Atmanirbhar Bharat. And so what we're proposing is, out of the 7,000 census towns that were identified in the 2011 census, maybe we pick 5,000 census towns and start working right now to make them the next urban center of growth, right? So we can equip them right now with power facilities, sewage facilities, low-cost housing, mass transit operations like the metro, public transportation, so that these cities follow a very different trajectory compared to the cities of yore, like Bangalore and Bombay, that were very legacy-oriented. They were there because of certain historical reasons, and then we started just piling it on. But these cities will have a very different very different look from the get-go. And what is going to be crucial is the third point, to be able to situate labor-intensive industries near these census towns. So put up these industrial clusters, have each district come out with a good industrial plan to be able to develop products there to meet the demands of the internal market of India. Connect all these towns and industrial clusters with high-speed infrastructure, high-speed railways, high-speed roads, and that's where the growth will come from. That's where Atmanirbhar Bharat can truly take place, because we can have our manufacturing hubs there. We can connect them to all the ports. We can develop our ports, both on the western coast and the eastern coast, and that is how we start competing with China and with other markets to make Atmanirbhar Bharat. Now, the other things that India needs to be able to fix right now is our human capital development. I think with the new National Education Policy 2020 that just came out, we have a great chance to overhaul our education infrastructure, remove out the legacy problems that we were facing with it, and really build India's youth to respond to the demands of the new market, respond to the demands of the knowledge economy, and build on the skills that is required to build in India, develop in India, and own the intellectual pipeline in India. India hardly produces any intellectual property compared to China or the US, and we should be able to change that. And that is crucial to develop in India, because otherwise we'll only be importing designs from outside and manufacturing it here. That is not a good strategy for Atmanirbhar Bharat. So we have to be able to produce the intellectual property here. For that, we need human capital. And the other points that I will very quickly mention is, we need to improve our healthcare infrastructure. That is going to be crucial. We cannot the pandemic already showed us where the fault lines are with our healthcare infrastructure. We have to be able to patch that. We need a 500-bed multidisciplinary hospital in each and every district. If you look at maybe the 720 districts of India today, maybe 500 don't have those facilities, and that proved to be a problem during the pandemic. further pandemics will always happen. We have to be able to ready. We have to be able to be ready for that with infrastructure and digital infrastructure, like the Bharat Health Stack, for example, that's being. So we need to be able to marry all these intersections and really build for the India of the future.
Right. So I'll actually taking forward the points that you mentioned. You also write about how the pandemic has exposed challenges and opportunities, and how they can be addressed. Through multidimensional technology frameworks, and you see the role
Absolutely.
of world-class indigenous technology in it. So, in that light, what do you think of the Atmanirbhar app challenge? And of course, you've already addressed the banning of the Chinese apps, but yeah, the former.
So, I mean, to look at the larger picture, only two nations today are in charge of their digital realms. That's the United States and China. And the United States, because of their first mover advantage, because they were the first to develop these technologies and digital platforms, and because of the globalization of their private enterprise, everyone in the world today uses some form of American technology, right? Either we're searching on Google, or we're communicating with people on WhatsApp, we're using Twitter, so on and so forth. And that is a dangerous situation for us, because our data is not localized in India. All, your data, my data, MDP's data, everyone's goes to the United States. It's available to their government, it's available to their private enterprise for monetization. Because China closed its market all those years ago, India was the only billion plus market that they could come into for all that data, and they have done it. And you and I, we're citizens of India. We are not citizens of the US. So if someone misuses our data, we have no recourse in any court of law. We can't go to the US because we are termed illegal aliens there, right? And we can't go to India because our data is not in India. So on one hand, that's a dangerous situation, because we're caught with the United States digital realm. On the other hand, we have China, which by design has had a very hegemonic outlook towards the rest of the world. They, as MDP said, they protect their digital realm and their technology space very carefully, but they want to go out and conquer everyone else's, right? And so in that context, and especially with the national security concerns that India started facing both at the border and digitally, I think the Chinese apps ban came at a great time. I'm very glad that the government recognized this threat and took decisive steps to stop it. And now, as you mentioned in your question, we need indigenous technology to take the place of all these apps and all these platforms that are being banned and that we do not wish to use. And for that, we do need government intervention. We need government support, because it's not just about building apps. I think the Atmanirbhar app challenge is very crucial. I think India's innovation and ingenuity is going to come out through this challenge. We're already seeing that. That's great. But we also need the upstream and downstream dependencies to be fixed. So we need cloud infrastructure, we need data localization, we need data centers to be placed in India so that all Indians' data is in India. We need and we need hardware. So we can't afford all our phones. Of course, now the government has taken a good step. So many millions of phones we're producing here, but the designs still come from outside. We don't own our own phone designs, and everyone I know is either on an iPhone designed by the US, or an Android phone mostly designed by China, or in some cases Korea. So we need to be able to change that. As I mentioned, we need the intellectual pipeline to change that. We need our intellectual pipeline for the telecommunication equipment, for the cloud equipment. So the Chinese app ban and the Atmanirbhar app challenge, I think, are very good first steps, but it has to be backed by serious investment and technology development to be really, we have to own our digital space. We have 1.4 billion Indians whose security is paramount to us, and we need to be able to really fortify that.
Right.
MDP, anything to add?
Yeah, please.
No, that's good, Nisha. That's very good.
Okay.
Yeah. So actually, Nisha mentioned it briefly, but you've also written about it, sir, that India's demographic dividend is dwindling. That there are crores of youngsters whose skills are unsuited for the economy. Would you like to elaborate on that, please?
The most important asset for a country are its people. And in India, we have been brought up with this thinking that we are an overpopulated country, we got too many people, etc., which is very wrong. Our fertility has now come down to 2. And if you look at China, after they had the one-child policy from 1978, China's working age population has shrunk in the last 3 years. China may become older, before it becomes richer. And the number of people above 60 is increasing in China compared to India. If you look at the Indian population pyramid, I'm sure Nisha will talk about that, you'll find that we're producing less children now than we did about 5 to 6 years ago. So we are in the midst of a large number of young people coming into the workforce. And that those people coming in the workforce have to be skilled, have to be educated, and we have to produce jobs, and we are failing in that. Now, if you look at the whole of South India's fertility has come down to 1.7. They're better educated, they're better trained. There are many more jobs in South India than North India. In the states of Bihar, UP, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, etc., there's a population bulge. And I think in Bihar particularly, the average age, I think, is 15 years. Right, Nisha? The average age is 15 or 19 years. 19 years, I think. And the average age for India is 27 years.
Yeah.
But in Bihar, the gross enrollment rate for higher education is just 13. And that's ridiculous. At least UP is 26. So we have a large bulge of people all over. And the good news is that young women are now coming out in higher numbers in higher education. We're going to have more women as a percentage of their population in college than men. In school too, there are more girls than men. But the tragedy is that women who graduate don't have jobs in the state, and that's why the participation in the labor force has come down, because many of them are coming in North India and there are no jobs. The boys will migrate, young people will migrate. In Kerala, women gross enrollment rate is 43% and men is 30. The Kerala women are very highly educated, and the unemployment rate in Kerala is 23% for men. I mean, for women, I think men is about 15% or so. For women, is 23%. So women are more vulnerable. So I think unless we educate, unless we grow industry, that's why India requires Atmanirbhar Bharat, where we'll have labor-intensive industries in area where there are labor. That's why UP is very important, Bihar is very important, Madhya Pradesh and Rajasthan are very important, because unless these areas grow very fast, India will not grow. The per capita income of UP is 69,000 rupees. The whole of India is about 1,50,000 rupees. Bihar is 49,000 rupees. Karnataka is nearly 2,50,000 rupees. Look at Karnataka, 2,50,000. UP has 69,000. Yeah. And UP has got about 22 crore people. So I think India is at a very crucial step. And my feeling is one entire generation, 200 million young people, will pass through our population in the next 25, 30 years without doing well. They're the lost generation. That's the extreme step, because the youth bulge started about 15 years ago in the UPA era. And that time they didn't focus on skills, didn't focus on education. They did focus on skill, but not too much. Modi's first government has done very well. And now the impact of that youth bulge, because they were born, the bulge was there. And only in the last 10 years, the number of babies being born is slowly coming down. So there is a bulge, and the bulge has to go through the system. And that's why you see all across North India, a lot of young people, 18, 21, 22, ill-educated, ill-skilled, on the streets, writing, doing all kind of stuff. You saw the Muslim community too, when this fight happened, when this CAA thing happened and all that, you saw all these young Muslim kids come out in the street and throw stones. They had not been educated. Muslim GER is only about, I think, 5.2%, 5.7%. India is about 26, right?
9.7.
So 9.7. Sorry, 9.7 for India, right? Out of 9.7, whereas India is 26%. And I think this is a big tragedy. So if you look at various parts of India, various parts of the society, there is a big issue. So demographically, we are challenged. That is the honest truth. We can all gloss over it and say, Mera Bharat Mahan, blah, blah, blah. But this is the truth. So we have to live through it for the next 25, 30 years. But the generation now is coming out of school and in college will do very well, because they're going to come out into the workforce when India is $5 trillion going up to $10 trillion, right? The generation that's already come in the workforce in the last maybe 10 years, they're not doing very well because they don't have jobs. They're already passing through low-paying jobs. Nisha?
Yeah, no, I agree. And, Nivedita, this is worrisome because in the future, we're already seeing that now, growth, economic growth, social growth is going to come from the knowledge economy, right? The exchange of ideas, the development of intellectual property, the use of internet and digital platforms. And it's no longer a volumes game. It was a volumes game when it was an agricultural economy. It was a volumes game when it was a primarily industrial economy. But now, in this new world of the knowledge economy, human capital is going to be very important. And that's why this demographic dividend is very important, because that youth bulge is going through India now. We heard from MDP about the fertility numbers, they're dropping. Of course, it's uneven across India, but by and large, they're dropping. And, just to put some numbers out there, the 1991 census, the percentage of children in the ages of 0 to 6 years as part of the population was 18%. By 2011, 20 years later, it had already dropped to 13%. And data shows from the civil registration system and other birth data that the percentage of children in the population in 2021 will be about 11%. So we are aging, albeit slowly, not as fast as China, because they enacted the one-child policy. But we are aging, and soon we're going to have a large aging population supported by a gradually shrinking workforce. And so the volumes are not going to work anymore. We have to be able to skill, we have to be able to improve the productivity of our workforce, because if our workforce numbers are going to keep decreasing and we have to sustain the economic output and keep increasing it at 8% year on year, we have to be able to count on skills. And so that's why this demographic dividend is so important, and also is going to be a disaster if we don't deal with it right now, which is why I'm hoping for a really quick turnaround of this national education policy. I'm hoping for the skill development programs to be put into place, the vocational training to be put into place. Yes, it will take 10, 15 years to see the results, but the time to act is now, to be able to still, accrue the benefits of this demographic dividend. We're the only country in the world that has this going for us right now. Every other country, either their young population is a very small percentage of the population, or it's a small country and the numbers are just not there. India is the only place where we have that advantage. We have to be able to take advantage of that right now.
Yeah. As someone who comes...
Nisha, just tell us about the social breakup of graduates from college. I think that's very revealing.
Oh, yes, I think that data is excellent. So we did a survey last year. The MHRD publishes year-to-year statistics on the higher education, and it's a wonderful report to go through. Such a treasure trove of data. And if you look at the social breakup of India, you have the SCs, the SCs, the STs, the OBCs. The higher education statistics gives us the Muslim enrollment, other minorities, and then the general population, right? SCs and STs and OBCs, their percentage of enrollment in higher education is now exceedingly close to their percentage in the population. For example, SCs, they're about 14% of the enrollment and about 16% in the population. So they're very close. STs, they're about 5.5% of the higher education enrollment, whereas in the population, they're at about 8%. So again, very close. OBCs are doing wonderfully as well. They're about 41% of the population and 36% of the enrollment. And their enrollment rates are still pretty high. So in about 5 years, we think it will normalize. Their composition in higher education will be equivalent to their composition in the population. So reservation has worked. These social groups have done very well. Unfortunately, we're not seeing the same kind of progress with minorities. Muslims in particular, they're about 15% of the population according to this 2011 census, but they're only 5% of higher education enrollment. The silver lining is Muslim women are enrolling at greater rates than Muslim men. So I'm very happy to see that the rise of the woman wave is going through all the communities. We're seeing it across India. We're seeing it across communities. General merit enrollment is actually coming down. Contrary to popular belief, we're about 13% of the population, and the enrollment has actually come down from 45% to 36%. So I think social groups are doing very well, barring the Muslims. And the Muslim community must really start rallying around its youngsters, because it has a huge young base. They must use the allocations they get from the Ministry of Minority Affairs. There's a 4,500 crore budget every year to be able to place more schools and colleges in Muslim-dominated areas, especially in the states with significant Muslim population like Uttar Pradesh, Kerala, etc., to really increase the gross enrollment ratio of the community. But in general, social groups are doing very well in India. It's a great thing to see.
Yeah.
Nivedita, you'll be very happy. I think you should have a separate program with separate video with Nisha later about the rise of the Indian women.
I would
Yes.
Nisha
love
has
to talk to her about
studied the
that.
data about.
Yeah, yeah.
You should do a separate program, The Rise of the Indian Woman, because Nisha has made a comprehensive report which reveals from all data that this decade is going to be the rise of the Indian woman. Indian women are going to dominate this decade. There are more girls in school than boys, more girls graduating, more girls in MBBS and becoming doctors. 40% of the incoming class in good engineering colleges are women. Women are joining the workforce in large numbers in South India, where there are more jobs. North India has got a problem. Many things. I think in technology, in professions, everywhere else. I think it's wonderful to see that Indian women are doing. So all this leftist narrative of Indian women being suppressed, Indian women not doing is all rubbish, because
Yes.
they finally come into their own. And even if the literacy is below that of men, that is because the Nehruvian policy of the last 60 years did not educate a girl child that time. If you not educated the girl child in the first 2 decades of independence, and they've been illiterate because you are not invested in them, they're still alive. And that cohort is showing up as greater illiteracy. And if you look at girls in the age group of 6 to, let us say, 20, literacy is extremely high.
Yeah, no, it's really heartening to see the numbers for women, in the case of women. Yeah.
And just to add to that, even in states like Bihar, where the general gross enrollment ratio is low, it's about 13, the enrollment rates of women in higher education is higher than men. So it's a pan-Indian phenomenon. It's happening across communities. It's happening across states. I think the Indian woman has arrived. And now, if we can find a way, through Atmanirbhar Bharat and other policies, to be able to translate the graduates to the workforce, that will be fantastic, because then we're onboarding half the population onto the workforce. Our jobs numbers will go up, our output will go up, and there's no better way to kickstart the economy again after COVID, I think.
Yeah. So my mother is principal in a village school in UP, and it's a
Wonderful.
girls' school. So, and we've seen over the years how the number of students enrolling in the school has risen, and also the girls who actually, pass out of school and then go on to achieve higher education. So that's really heartening to see.
And UP in particular is fantastic because UP has the largest college base in the country. Out of the 91 lakh graduates in India overall, UP graduates 15 lakh graduates every year. Like that's by far the biggest, and more than half of the graduating class are women. So UP has done a fantastic job with having women study in higher education. It just has to find a way to translate that into employment, and then the state will be transformed.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Mr. Pai, you are known as a big picture guy. So, what are some of the smaller things, some of your rituals or quirks? How do you look at issues? Basically, the idea is to understand how do you approach a problem? How do you think? If you could talk about that.
Well, my approach is data based, because to take a good decision, you must have data. So when you see a problem, for example, unemployment, you try to gather data. What is the total number of people in the age group of, let's say, 21 to 60 who are working age? Of them, how many are in rural areas? How many are in services? How many in industry? How many are, in agriculture? How many are getting educated? How many are coming out as graduates? You gather all the data. And based upon the data, you analyze and look at jobs. Now, what are the areas where jobs are captured? EPFO, Employees Provident Fund for formal jobs, because for an enterprise with more than 20 people, you have to pay PF. So the data is there. We got the data done. A monthly report comes up. ESI, where 91 industries with more than 10 people have to register. These are the two big databases. Then you got government, because government employs 2.5 crore people. So you take all that, and then you start deducing. Then you look at income tax data. If you look at income tax data, you find that there are 2.21 crore people, 2.21 crore people filing returns and declaring income under the head income from business and profession. Now, if you're an income tax payee, you are having a profession or a business, minimum you'll have 5 employees, because you'll have a small office, right? And you'll have a personal secretary, you'll have an office boy, you'll have 2 or 3 people working with you. So you'll have 5 people. That means 10 crore people are employed. So take all the data, because today we have the left narrative that unemployment, we just survey 60,000 people, creating for a consumer pyramid survey, and then comes out date saying that 12 crore people were unemployed, 26%. Suddenly it falls to 8%. Now the new thing they're saying is 21 million, 2.1 crore people lost their jobs because of COVID. All salaried people. If 2.1 crore people jobs are lost, they'll be all over the place. We don't see them at all. So where are they? So I think the key thing is look at all the data, look at all the sources, and link all the sources together. Both of us have created a lot of articles using data, deducing data, and I think it works very well. For example, we wrote a report. I think Nisha will talk about wrote a report about how many people are really poor in India. What is the total amount of poverty? And we worked backwards, and we came to a figure which is remarkably close. Nisha, can you explain that about the DBT?
So that's right. So it's really interesting because if there's a classic definition of poverty, which is if you have less than $2 a day to subsist on, then you're poor, right? This is the World Bank definition of poor. And if you look at data, now India did have a very large population that was below this $2 a day, but that's not true anymore. As a percentage of the population, that percentage has come down. Today, we can estimate about 50 million people live like that with less than $2, and that poverty has to be eradicated. But if you look above that, right, if you start defining poverty as a lack of purchasing power, then of course there's a lot more people who come into that ambit. But India has a very special problem. See, what's happened is we're reeling under 70 years of subsidies, right? So these people that we keep classifying as poor, these are the people who have to go from one office to the other every year to be able to get their subsidies every year, every month. But in fact, so one of the suggestions that we've been making is if we can now use this great program that PM Modi has come up with, which is the direct benefit transfer, which has already shown us that they have saved 1.7 lakh crore rupees already with the DBT transfers, right? So it's a great program, and you can cut out all the middlemen, you can cut out all the inefficiencies, and you can directly send money from the government subsidy schemes into the bank account of the beneficiary. And so if you start looking at it like that, we're saying, can we eradicate poverty completely by this DBT 2.0 model, where we take all the subsidies that the Indian government and state governments give, which is a lot, by the way. So if I have to just give some numbers, right, the government spends, the central government spends about 2 lakh crores every year on food subsidies, and state government spend about 50,000 crores. There's fertilizer subsidy, the Maganrega subsidy, LPG, PM Kisan, power, water, interest subsidy, loan write-offs for farmers, etc. Together, all of this comes up to, how much? 7.4 lakh crores every year. And that's about, 3% of our GDP right there. And many times, a lot of the same people are going to take these subsidies. And so what happens is they're going from one office to another, to another. And so the inefficiency in the system is just mind-boggling. And all these people get labeled poor. Instead, if we can have this as a direct income scheme, give people, say, 3,000 per month directly into their bank account. We're already doing this with the farmers. We're already doing this with the rural workers. And that way, this counts as income. These people now have money coming into their account directly. No one's telling them how to spend it. They can choose to spend it either to put their kids in a better school, or they can choose to buy better grains. They can spend it however they wish. And so now we're going to give dignity back to these people. Before they were going around begging for subsidies, and now they get some dignity back. So much of the inefficiency gets cut out. And so this is really how India should start approaching poverty. And it all starts with data, as MDP said. Now, if there are a couple of different ways of looking at this. And let's start with the three large economic sectors of India. We have agriculture, we have industry, and we have services. There is a very large asymmetry today where the contribution of agriculture to GDP is only 17%, but the number of people working in the sector is huge, 43% of our workforce, and consequently 43% of our population. Whereas services contributes about 55% to the economy, and has only about 35% of the workforce working in it, and the balance is industry. So if we start from those numbers, we can start looking at how many people are in the government sector, how many people are working in the services sector, and start pulling out all those numbers. And then that's when we figure out that maybe about 17 crore families kind of with all the various digital schemes that the Narendra Modi government has put in place over the last 6 years, which is fantastic because we have records, we have all these things, and that to exactly who these 15 crore families are that need support, and then start sending money directly into their account to be able to eradicate poverty finally in India.
Yeah.
Nice data for you, Nivedita. See?
Yeah.
And the data, Nivedita, data is available.
Publicly
government
available.
should use data. I have worked with government in many areas. None of the secretaries ask for data. They don't even know data. I was called by a very senior official to look at employment data because, the opposition was saying unemployment had gone up, and Prime Minister asked them, give me the numbers. They didn't know how to get numbers. The numbers are there. They don't look at it. And the mentality is very different. Mentality is to make big statements without numbers. We all work with data. See, today, how will you use data? In Infosys, Narayan Murthy used to tell us, anything we go to him, get me the data. In God we trust. In God we trust. For the rest, we need data. So if our political leaders tell secretary, show me the data, everybody will start working with data, and they're not used to it. So any problem, you have to get data, you have to analyze, you have to find out, you have to segment, and you have to come with a solution to meet the data, because the solution depends upon how you segment the population, how you isolate the problems and work on the problem. To give you a small example, the Niti Aayog did a wonderful program called the Aspirational District Program. India has 720 districts. Maybe 200, 220 districts are urban, are doing well. The rest are very poor districts. For example, Salman Khurshid told me, the former minister told me, in his constituency of Farrukhabad with 22 lakh people, there were only 5 ambulances. Can you believe that? Only 5 ambulances. After 60 years, 5 ambulances is ridiculous. They got nothing there. And, he raised 20 ambulances because all of us gave money to him. And, we helped him because, it is a pitiable case. Now, if they came with the program and said, let us pick the 125 poorest districts in India. So they made a norm, and they got the poorest district. Then they'll say, let us implement all the government schemes in those districts. Government has got a lot of schemes. There is no shortage of scheme. There is no shortage of money. It's remarkable what has happened, and politically it paid off. About 67% of the people in the aspirational district voted for the Modi government. And Prime Minister Modi has done great things for this country. Let me tell you, Nivedita, no Prime Minister in India's history has done as much for the poor in 5 years as Prime Minister Modi has done. And Nisha has published articles on that. Just tell us what
wonderful work. I think the rural road connectivity was a big deal. 1.5 lakh gram panchayats got fiber optics, and now their villages have internet connection. They got clean water all the way to the taps in their villages, if not their houses, which is a big deal. India is now almost 100% open defecation free. The sanitation project was a huge success, and I can't believe it took the country 65 years to get there. So really remarkable achievement. And so there's so much that has been done. Mobile phone penetration is up, internet penetration is up, and just so much has been done. And now is that housing? Yes, so 1.5
DBT.
crore houses, DBT. Sorry,
gas stoves.
Sorry, yeah. So a lot has been done in the first term, and I think that has set up the basis for Atmanirbhar Bharat. It has set up the basis to really develop the economy this term. The first term they came in, they saw all these people who didn't have anything. They put the tax money to good use, and it really developed India. And so now is the time to pick that up and really drive it.
Yeah.
Nivedita, look at the brilliance of Narendra Modi. The people in the opposition, the leftists and all think, oh, Narendra Modi, he is not educated like us. He doesn't speak English like us. He is a karyakarta, blah, blah, blah. Well, he's won 2 elections, the largest number of votes in Indian history. Nobody has done that, right? Look at the brilliance of the man. When he first came, he stood up. Before he came, he stood up and said, Shauchalaya pehle, Devalaya baad mein. And he got the toilet program done. And the toilet program has a tremendous impact on women in rural areas, on children, and improves the health. Then he called for Digital India. He got 400 million, 40 crore bank accounts opened in the name of the woman. So he could do DBT. He has sent 12 lakh crores of DBT. He has given money to farmers, 6,000 rupees a year. Karnataka, they give another 6,000, 12,000 rupees a year. And then he has made sure that women get gas stoves to improve women's health. And he has built roads for them. He has given houses, 5 crore houses are getting built for everybody, correct? And he's also created, he had the Bedi Bachao, Beti Padhao case where he has stopped the infanticide of, baby girls, the baby child, the girl child. And then he has come out with many other programs to make sure he saves money. Yes, like Disha said, he saved 1,50,000 crores. Now, so much has been done for the poor. And and he communicates to the poor. He has a Mann Ki Baat every month. He talks to them. He tells them, and he has given awards like Padma Shri to the poorest of the poor. Earlier in the ancient regime, only those people who kowtowed to government, to talk to them and favor them, got all the awards. Now we are the poorest, the poor in some far nook and corner of the country where somebody does a wonderful job is talking to them. He went to Varanasi and he touched the feet of the the people who do the cleaning. Can you believe that? And in one of the award, there was a old woman who has spent 50 years growing trees in Karnataka. She went to Rashtrapati Bhavan in the best sari and she got an award and he held her feet.
Yeah.
The Prime Minister of this country, elected by the people, touches the feet of elderly woman and says, "You are my role model." Who has done this in this country? Has Nehru done it? Nehru was so arrogant, intellectually arrogant, and he thought that he has to be an Englishman to rule this country. Narendra Modi, and he's brilliant. Everybody underestimates the man. And look at the plan. He had Digital India, he had toilets, he had DBT. Because of that, he had the India Stack, he did everything else. And then he brought in Ayushman Bharat later to give everybody, he's given everybody the bare necessary lives. Then to create jobs, he brought in heavy infrastructure. We're building roads like nothing else. The railways are getting redone, the ports are getting redone. And then he brought in this Make in India program, right? And after Make in India program, we got this now Atmanirbhar Bharat coming. He banned the Chinese apps. Those are all because of certain events. And also, he has also made sure that he has sequenced it so well that India's base has been put up, and the great majority of people in this country are getting all the necessities of life. And execution has been fantastic. Every month he sits down and reviews the projects. Roads have been built where there were no roads before. In the north of the country, in Himalayas, tunnels have been built, roads have been built. India will ultimately build 5,000 kilometers of metro all over. Delhi has got 350 kilometers of metro, the second largest in the world today. And all over the country, we are seeing an enormous thing. You don't see the impact in our cities because the cities are not clean. Because our governance in the urban areas are pathetic. But in the villages, he's done so much. Once 2.5 lakh villages get internet, 1,50,000. Now, when COVID came, India is a large country, so enormous amount of money given as rations. We have a ration card which is portable all across India. Women, 80 crore people got rations for free of cost for 6 months. 20 crore women got money in the bank. 9.5 crore farmers got money. It went seamlessly just like that. Somebody told me that he came to Tumkur near Bangalore one day and spoke in the evening and said, "I'm going to do this." Next day morning, the money hit the farmer's bank account. Look at this. Can it happen in this country? And this is a large country. No country in the world has been able to do this. The man is brilliant. People don't give him credit because they're very biased. They're extremely biased. They don't like a person who born in poverty, who has worked his way up, a patriot and a nationalist, to become prime minister and change. Because all of them want to control Delhi, sitting in Delhi, that Lutyens Delhi. But he's a man of the masses. People respond to him. And today, despite so much of COVID, despite so much of economic dislocation, he has got the highest rating in the world for any political leader. Why is that? Because you help the poor. You help everybody. People trust him. He has stopped corruption. He's got the best defense good. No corruption scandal. No corruption at all anywhere, at least central government. Look at the work that's been done. It's unbelievable. But that man is brilliant. He has sequenced it. He has done it so beautifully. If you go back and look at the sequence and see what it has done, he certainly had a plan and he did it.
Yeah. So, the India of today, certainly, there are challenges, but it holds a lot of promise. And you've been an inspiring ambassador of that promise. So, if we had to know your thoughts on this, sir, on in the post-COVID world order, what is the potential and the purpose and the promise of India?
India is going to be a world leader again in all facets of human activity. It is going to be the third largest economy in nominal terms. We are the fifth largest. And we are going to grow in the next 10 years at least 6 to 7% a year in real terms. With the nominal terms, maybe 9 to 10%. India will be a world leader. India will eliminate poverty. India will make sure that every Indian can hold his head high. Every child can realize his or her dream. Every child gets a good education. Every young person can go to college and there'll be jobs. There'll be good infrastructure. The quality of life will go up. Governance will improve. And nobody will dare send terrorists into our territory. Nobody will dare send terrorists. India will stand up. India doesn't want to go after any other country. We want to protect borders. We are not an aggressive power, but as a defensive power will not allow anybody to come inside. And globally, India is respected. India is not a beggar country like Pakistan. We don't go and beg anybody, right? We invite foreign investment on our terms. We want foreign investors to come. We'll treat them fairly, but we want their economy to open to us. If China shuts its economy, doesn't open, we're not going to open our economy. We are not going to sign that treaty in Asia, the trade treaty in Asia, because we don't want to have a free trade agreement with China, because China will not open its market. They don't keep their promise. And we have become friends with the Middle East. In the Middle East, respect for India has gone up. The Muslim world, respects India, not Pakistan. Saudi Arabia gave highest award to Prime Minister Narendra Modi. UAE has become our friend. Of course, Turkey is a backward country. Politically, they're doing all kind of crazy things. Europe is looking up to India for global security in the Indian Ocean. The United States has become more friendly with India, but they can't push you over. So India will be a strong, independent country where we can be legitimately proud. I think all young Indians should be proud, should be patriotic, should be nationalistic about India, and we should not accept anybody trying to push us around. So I'm very proud of this country. I've been watching progress for the last maybe 35 years. And I worked in the IT industry. In the IT industry from 94 till now, I've seen the rise of a great country, India. I've seen the rise of a great industry, the IT industry. And I've seen the rise of a great company, Infosys. So I'm very proud of my country. And I'm very, very optimistic about the future. Nisha, you are much younger than me, Ma. You should talk about it. What is your view about India?
No, absolutely. I agree with everything you said. And I think it's really exciting because apart from everything that MDB mentioned, there's also so many opportunities here. So I think for the younger people who are, coming out of college or going into college and they're wondering what to do, it's no longer like 30, 40 years ago where there were hardly any opportunities. You have to really look around to see what to join. Now there's so many opportunities. People have multiple avenues to go down in India. You can, our financial technology sandbox is one of the most exciting in the world. There's so much we can do there. We're innovating in enterprise tech. Our biotech companies are doing so well, especially with COVID. We're seeing so many great innovations come out. Our defense manufacturing is on the rise, and there's just so many opportunities. They're overhauling the education system. So really, there's no reason to complain anymore. There's no reason to say, okay, there's nothing going on in India, I'm just going to leave. There's so much going on here. There's so many opportunities. We just have to keep our eyes open, figure out where we want to place our skills, and just go ahead with it. Because India is on the rise, and I think anyone worth their salt is going to join this journey and contribute to India becoming the superpower that MDP just envisioned for us.
Yeah. So any
Nisha, you went to the US for a MTech. You did very well.
That's
You
right.
got a great job there in one of the best companies in the world. Why did you come back?
So the plan was always to come back. I never intended to settle down there. And I'm extremely aware of the fact that I'm in the minority in my generation for having that. But as I said, India is very exciting. It is also, my motherland. So I can't think of settling anywhere else because India is where my heart is. India is where my stomach is. I want my Indian food, and I want the environment that India provides, which is very unique. I've traveled around the world, and I've never seen the kind of environment in any other country that India provides. There's warmth, there's culture, there's a civilization which depths no other civilization can match today. You go to China, you go to Europe. They have great traditions, they have great architecture, they have great everything, but it cannot match what India has. It cannot match that enduring spirit that India has. We've looked at almost 1,000 years of invasions, colonization. We've had our languages destroyed. We've had our temples of learning destroyed. We've had our temples destroyed. But even then, that spirit endures. For for the large part, still live like our ancestors used to 1,000 years ago. The food traditions are unbroken. The praying traditions are unbroken. So there's so much unbroken lineage in this country that I didn't want to part from it. And so I went to the US with a very specific intent. I wanted to learn at, they are the best universities in the world. They've really figured out how to build for research, how to build for innovation. I wanted to be part of that to see how such a system works. And I was very fortunate to be able to do that. I then subsequently worked in Silicon Valley, where, at Applied Materials, one of the best companies in the world. I learned a lot, but part of me started missing India, and that's when I immediately made my way back. And I'm very happy I did, because India is really blooming, and I'm very happy to be part of this journey that our country is going through at this stage.
You actually spoke for me, Nisha. Like, that's exactly how I feel about India. I haven't traveled as much as you have, but I can't think of living anywhere else. And India is exciting.
Yes, yes. And on an everyday basis, when you start missing the masala dosa and the filter coffee, it's time to go back. So that's what happened to me.
So, any parting words for our young viewers? What would you like to tell them?
No, my parting words to young viewers says, next 10 years is going to be the best year in the 5,000-year history of India. India is going to transform. India is going to leverage technology. There are going to be great opportunities. India is going to grow. India is going to become more powerful. India is a culturally rich country with a civilization. And you are so much to be proud about. And you can see the transformation every single day. The biggest challenges, the biggest problems to solve are in India. And you are going to do it. So you'll be at the heart of solving all the challenges of India. And you're going to build this country for the future. And you're going to see this country grow. And you're going to see people get a lot of good things in their life. You're going to see people get the necessities of life and the obtain opportunities. So you are going to be the heart of it, and you are going to do it. So, folks, this is the best place to be. And be proud of your country. Be proud of your country. There are many lefties, Lutyens Delhi, trying to pull you down, put some nonsense into your head and all kinds of things. Don't get carried away by them. Ignore them, because they're a dying breed. Be positive, be optimistic, work hard, struggle, and you'll do well. And you'll do very well for you economically. You'll do extremely well for you economically. Be honest, have integrity, love your country, be patriotic, be nationalistic, but put that fervor for the country along with the hard work, and you can achieve everything. Yes, it's going to be a tough journey. It is not going to be easy. You're not going to make money very soon. It's going to take some time. You have to struggle. You have to grow up. You have to do things. But you will be so happy that you are in a great country like India at this point of time. And you have so much of freedom in this country. So much of freedom. There is, compared to most of the countries, the freedom that we have here is excellent. So much of freedom, so much of, ability to do things. Nisha?
Absolutely. No, and I think India is, as I mentioned earlier, there is the US model of capitalist expansion. There is the China model of hegemonic expansion. And I think India is coming up with a very unique thing in the middle with the propagation of digital public goods, with the propagation of public infrastructure. There is just that sentiment that we need to build for the public. And that's what we saw with the Aadhaar system. That's what we saw with India Stack. And we're continuing to see with Ayushman Bharat, with the Bharat Health Stack. There is a sentiment to build for the bottom of the pyramid. There is a sentiment to build for everyone and not just the elite. And I think that is something I see India starting to export soon. We will soon be able to export these ideas and these architectures, these open architectures, the volunteer-led architecture to the world. It's going to be very important. So we're not just building for India, we're building for the world, because that is when India is going to start exporting these ideas very slowly. And that to me is extremely exciting about building in India today.
It has been such a pleasure talking to both of you. Thank you so much for giving us your time. Namaste.
Thank you so much, Nivedita. This was great. Thank you. Namaskara.
We'll be bringing more of these conversations to you. Keep watching New India Junction.